And the only reason I call it that is because when I saw this gait diagram, it reminded me of the movie IRobot with Will Smith, which is a really good movie. Wink. How many of you have not seen IRobot? It's really good. Wink. Okay, you'll know what that means when you watch it, but that was really good. And in the world of AI and robots, I hope that the robots that are out there are more like Sunny and not the rest of this army of evil robots. But nonetheless, it has become lovingly known as IRobot. I've been doing this for maybe 10 years when I taught kinesiology. And so as we go, I will call on everybody. It's okay if you get it wrong, but we are going to understand gait, and most importantly, as you've pointed out, what to do about it, okay, and how to tease out a question. So often when I've looked at practice exams, I've noticed that students will read a question about gait, posture, kinesiology, and they answer one of the distracting answers that is also true about the condition but isn't true about the joint being asked. So if you're asked a hip question, the answer is not going to be kyphosis, even if whatever condition that's going on at the hip could also accompany with kyphosis, right? But if they're asking you about the hip, you need to know what plane are they asking you. So if it's a sagittal plane question, the only option is flexion or extension. If it's a frontal plane question, the only options are abduction, adduction, okay? And so you need to be in the right plane and the right joint. That's how people miss gait and posture questions, because the other answer occurs in this world with that condition, but it's not what the question was. So I'm going to really be honing in on what joint, what position, what's gravity doing, and is the muscle active? Is it concentric? Is it eccentric? Isometric? Okay. Do you teach moments? Okay. Do you have a goniometer that's loosey-goosey? A floppy goni that I could use?
We do have some gonies over in that drawer by Hamburg. You want like a loose one?
I need a loosey one, yeah. Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, let me start with something here. When you're trying to answer a question about a muscle activation at a joint, especially during gait or basically gait, basically what you're saying is, what is the body doing to fight gravity? Okay. If I hold my elbow here, and I'm talking about elbow, what plane of motion does elbow activity occur in? Sagittal. Okay, let's back up. Let's make sure we're on the same, because this is where terminology will screw you up too, so let's make sure we're on the same page. We have the sagittal plane, anterior posterior plane. Okay. We have the frontal plane, also some people call it coronal. Okay, that's left to right, side to side, east to west. Okay, if we call this north and south, this is east and west. We have the rotational plane, which is the, what is it? Transverse plane. It doesn't matter where my body is. If it's rotating, it's transverse plane. It doesn't matter where my body is. If I'm flexing, extending, it's sagittal plane. Everybody agree to that? Now you have an axis, which might also be called a fulcrum, which also might be called point of rotation of the joint. So in the sagittal plane, what axis does the joint? It's in the frontal or the medial lateral. You sometimes call it the medial lateral axis, because sometimes you're using the same word for two different things. So I have a sagittal plane and a sagittal axis. So the sagittal plane is this. The sagittal axis is this, right? It's abduction, it's sagittal. So it's sometimes easier to use sagittal plane, medial lateral axis.
So you wouldn't say frontal axis?
You would. Oh. I think that's confusing, so I've never used them in the same sentence. I always use medial lateral axis, sagittal plane. Oh, okay. I don't know how your questions are going to be worded. So we want to make sure we understand that those are synonymous. They might say anterior posterior axis for abduction, right? It's where the stick would go on a wooden figurine. Okay? Are we clear on axis and plane? Because that can be confusing. Okay.
That's clear on the other terminology.
Sure. Yeah, so in my attempt to simplify, I've always used medial, lateral, anterior, posterior for the axis. Because the planes were using up the words frontal, sagittal, transverse. So we want to make sure that we're clear because we don't know which. So sagittal plane goes about a frontal coronal axis, but that also could be a medial lateral axis. Yeah.
The medial lateral same as
Mm-hmm.
and then anterior
Posterior.
same as sagittal.
Yes.
Did I miss one?
Rotational, you have the transverse plane and longitudinal axis. You ever use longitudinal for the axis? Or do you say transverse axis?
Transverse. We say transverse.
For both?
Yeah.
Okay, longitudinal is also the transverse. Yeah.
I learned longitudinal.
Yeah, because it's like they say if you go up the middle finger, you know, that's like pronation, supination. So remember, all your rotations, you've got pronation, supination, but at the shoulder, it's internal, external, or medial, lateral, same thing. And we had a third one, internal, and we had internal, medial, and there was a third one for us. That one's gone now.
Yeah.
Inward and outward we used to use. Yeah.
I understand planes, but I don't really understand axis.
Okay, good question. So if I were going to create a little wooden doll or this skeleton, and I needed to put a stick through it so that the joint would move in the way that it's anatomically created to move. Let's move it over here for. So, yeah. So for flexion extension of the shoulder, where is the actual pin in this model? It moves in the sagittal plane. Which way is the pin? The pin is the axis that it rotates around. It's a frontal plane axis. Medial lateral.
It's pointing in that direction.
The pin has to stick through here for it to go around. And it's literally attached in here. Let's look at the elbow. What plane does elbow flexion and extension occur in? Sagittal plane. But where does the pin have to go through at your elbow to make it bend like that? Medial lateral or frontal? Where do you put the goniometer? Where do you put the goniometer? The axis of the goniometer, fulcrum. So the axis might also be called the fulcrum or the center of rotation, depending on which book you're reading. It's where the joint moves around.
But it's always going to be like if it's a sagittal plane, it's always going to be a frontal.
It's going to be a perpendicular.
So you can always just remember.
Yes. Yes, and it's very important to understand which axis and plane you're dealing with because it eliminates all other options of answers.
I can do that. I know like what it is. Like,
yeah.
Or like how to correlate them.
Okay. So when you have ab and adduction, that's occurring in the frontal plane, right? Where's the axis of rotation? And the point at which it rotates anatomically is where you put the goniometer, right? So that's your axis, okay? Make sense? Okay, now I'm going to layer onto that another one. So here's our ankle joint. When we're talking about posture and gait, if this is my tibia, this is my foot, and this is my fibula over here, my lateral malleolus. If my foot is in this position and I were to pass out, fall asleep, or whatever, what would gravity's pull on my foot create? Plantar flexion or dorsiflexion? If right now I fall asleep, right? It's going to undorsiflex. It's going to plantar flex. The direction that gravity acts on a joint when muscles are removed from the equation is called a moment. It's where we get the word momentum. So at any point in time, there is a moment, which is potential energy, potential movement at every joint in your body. And the only reason you are all laying on the floor is because you are opposing every moment at every joint with muscle activity or leaning or something, Okay? So let's go back to the elbow. If I simply just have my hand here, what moment by the force of gravity is active in my elbow joint? Is it an extension moment or a flexion moment? An extension moment. If I pass out, I'm at a wedding and I'm standing there and I'm like pass out, and which way would my joints go? Have you ever seen one of those little wooden dolls with the elastic inside and you push the button on the bottom and it collapses? Okay, it will collapse into whatever moments are occurring, whatever is the potential motion. Okay, it makes sense? So it's a moment. So if my elbow is flexed and there's an extension moment on the weight of my arm by gravity, why isn't my arm moving? Because an equal moment or an equal force is occurring. By which muscle? My biceps. My biceps are exerting the same force as the moment, the extension moment. Does that make sense? That is literally what controls our profession. Gravity and moments. All we're doing is either working with the moment to fall gracefully, or we're opposing it to actively move against it with the weight of the body. Okay? So we're going to identify the moment at each joint during gait. So we can determine what muscle is creating it, and sometimes no muscle is creating it. Sometimes it's momentum, and sometimes it's gravity. Okay? Make sense? If my arm is up and I want to lower my arm, I could just go like that, but that's not so great. So if I want to control it, I'm falling gracefully. So I will control the moment with the antagonist. So if I am controlling shoulder extension, I'm going to use my flexors eccentrically. If I want to lift my arm up and oppose the extension moment that exists just because of gravity, and I want to flex, I have to flex against the entire weight of my arm actively, concentrically with my flexors. So for this conversation, we're not going to worry about what muscle is what most muscles we're not going to name. We're going to say flexors, extensors, okay? And in this exercise, we're going to stay in the sagittal plane. The only thing that happens in the coronal frontal plane that you need to worry about, that y'all know about, is glute med. We already know that one. So we're just going to assume you know that one. We're not going to get into rotation and talk about what happens when the pronation hits the floor and it unlocks this and blah, 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 up like that. We're going to just stick with the basic sagittal plane. Okay? All right. So on your paper, you have a chart like that. So go to that side that has all the figures on it. Do you teach, Lisa, traditional and Ranchos Los Amigos terminology for gait? Okay. As much as you hate that one, Ranchos Los Amigos. We're all going to be bilingual. Okay. So on that side, we're going to talk about each phase. See this phase right here? We're looking at the one with the muscles drawn in. That is the stance leg. Oh, let's move this guy. We're talking about the stance leg on this side because that's where 90% of your problems are. Who really has a problem swinging? Only a few people. Usually the problem is the stance, so we're going to focus on that. We're going to talk about this phase of gait, which is called, what does IC stand for in Ranchos? Initial contact. If you don't know what that is, write it in. What is the traditional for that? Heel strike, write that up here or somewhere. Heel strike, make sure you write heel strike, you know what this is. And then for your big writers, you're going to have to write small and write little, and I'll show you what to write. All right. Are you ready? At heel strike or initial contact, we're going to start with the hip, knee, and then the ankle. At the hip, what position is that hip in? Is it flexed or is it extended? It's flexed. Okay, no, don't write anything yet. It's flexed. How many degrees would you say it's flexed?
45.
No, not so much. 45 would be about here.
30.
25, 30. Let's just say 25, just for kicks and giggles. Here's what that's going to look like. We're going to use abbreviations. The hip is flexed. Put a check mark. Under motion. Motion means position. Hip motion, position. It's flexed. It's a check mark. And we said 25. So it's just going to look like this. All you're going to put in that box is flex 25. It's flex about 25. So for a full step length, how much flexion do you need at the hip? About 25. Do you have to do up here? No. Why do we work our patient up here? Because they have to get up a step. They have to get in a car, but it's not for walking. It's not for walking. Okay. Now, The hip is flexed. Now we're going to talk about this line. This is a new topic. This is a new concept. This line is showing you the ground reaction force vector. That's the GRFC. Okay, all it means is when this gait cycle is happening, what is the ground's reaction to the body? And the reason we need to know that is then what is the muscular reaction to that reaction so we don't fall? So this one, we're just looking at the picture. It's giving us the answer. So in relation to the hip, the ground reaction force vector has a force like this. Is that anterior or posterior to the hip joint? Anterior. So all you're going to write under GRFC is anterior, A-N-T. Okay? It's anterior. Now, if that ground reaction force vector is anterior to the hip and the hip is flexed, what is the moment at the hip? If I pass out right now, what will my hip do? Will it flex more or will it extend if the ground reaction force is in front? What is the
Flexion.
It's going to be flexion. Right? That makes sense, everybody? I pass out right now, my hip is going to flex more. So the force vector is anterior. The moment is flexion, check mark. The moment is flexion, check mark. If nothing else happens, I'm going to get more flexion at that moment. When my heel hits, I'm going to get this. And guess what? You've probably seen patients do that. Okay. Do I want that to happen at heel strike? Do I want to see my hip go like that? No. I don't want to give in to that moment. I need to fight the moment. What muscle group would not allow this to happen? Hip extensors. So all you're going to write, extension is the line, right? So the hip extensors. Now, will that be an eccentric or a concentric contraction of the hip extensors to oppose the flexion moment happening at the hip at heel strike? Eccentric. Good. So this is what the first box looks like. We're going to go through all the others. I won't have any other answers up here, so make sure that you ask me right now which one of those doesn't make sense. Does that all make sense? At the moment of heel strike, the hip is flexed.
Could you explain how the contraction is eccentric?
Because gravity is causing flexion, and I don't want flexion. I want to hold it. And I just actually came from here, and I'm stopping.
Okay.
So it's eccentric. If you said isometric, it wouldn't be wrong.
Okay.
And this won't be on a test, so we can have a little gray area. It's the point of understanding. So here's the point with this one. You see a patient, and every time they step, they fall forward. Their glutes are weak, and it can't fight the flexion moment. Who's your most common person who's going to have this? Who do you see doing this? The posterior approach hip replacement, because their glutes have been violated, right? And they get this. What do you call that gait deviation? Not antalgic. We don't know if it's painful. Gluteus maximus lurch. Have you heard that one? What do you guys call that here in Florida? It could be regional. It's not the bellhopper, but if someone tries to compensate for it, they might do this prior to getting there because they're tired of this.
Rocking horse.
Okay, so you might see a rocking horse. But because that could be a regional term, the writers of the test have to be equal. So they're probably going to call it by its name of its muscle or the action. So they might call it a gluteus maximus lurch. Or they might say there's a sudden drop. Now remember, we're in the sagittal plane. If it's a sagittal plane question, then give it a sagittal plane answer. Okay? If they ask you about a frontal plane drop, obviously we're talking Trendelenburg, but we're talking sagittal plane, so it's got to be the butt. Okay? Glute max, hip extender. Okay? What exercise would you do for a person displaying this gait deviation? Glute max exercises. Now, is this open chain or closed chain for glute max? Closed chain. So work at closed chain. How would you work at closed chain? What would be a great exercise for this person? Bridges is a great one. Now take me 2 weeks later. I needed to work the way I needed to work. I'm walking and I can't keep my hip from collapsing. So why don't I work it on the stair stepper? And I'm going to tap, 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 tap. Okay? We're going to get nice and intimate. We're going to work the glutes so it knows that when my heel hits, I need this to hold like a William Wallace Braveheart. Hold.
My favorite movie.
Okay? Paint your face blue and let's go to town. Okay, does that make sense? Eccentric glute max is acting against a flexion moment at the hip at heel strike. Does that, you good? Are we ready to roll? All right, let's go to the knee. All right, let's go to the knee at heel strike. What position? Now, the writers of the test know all the answers. They understand the gait cycle. I just want to make sure that we're being as exact as possible because this one does matter. At heel strike, what is the exact position of the knee joint? Anybody have a different answer? If it was fully extended, it would look like this. Even full, because of the moments at play. What happens at the knee? We do full extension and then 5 degrees. The position, the motion right here for the knee, right down, 5 degrees, check mark. We have some shock absorption going on. This is what? The unweighting of the screw home mechanism. Screw home mechanism, popliteus, okay? Have you heard screw home mechanism? Femur, internal, tibia, external, tight, tight, tight. And then in order to not hyperextend our knee at landing, the popliteus unlocks enough that we can set the foot down at the heel just a little bit. This is when quads and hams are really trying to play nice together. And we need them both to play, okay? So the motion is 5 degrees flexion. But where is this ground reaction force vector? Relation to the knee joint. It's anterior, so write anterior for the GRFCQLMNOP. So, just as an extra question, where is the axis of rotation or the joint motion for the knee joint? Where do you put the goni to measure knee flexion extension? Knee joint. What's the axis of the knee joint? The femoral condyle, right? It's a big bump, so it's a condyle. If it was a little bump, it would be an epicondyle. So the big old earmuff over at the femur, the condyle is the axis of rotation, and this line is anterior to it. So what moment is occurring at the knee based on the reaction of the floor? Flexion or extension? The line's in front. So let's do this. If my line is in front of the knee joint, what's going to happen? I'm this way. It's like flamingo looking, but it's extension. When the line is in front of the knee joint, the ground hitting is actually would hyperextend it. That's why we flex it 5 degrees so we don't throw our knee out when we land. We have to have it slightly flexed. Does that make sense? So it's an extension moment, but our knee is flexed. What muscle helped us to get the 5 degrees of flexion against an extension moment? It would have to be a flexor, right? So the hamstring is actually active right there. But the tricky part of this one is, so is the quads. At heel strike, we know the quad's active or we'd fall down. But we don't have the quads actually working real hard yet because we have an extension moment, okay? So at this moment, I just want you to know that you have quad and ham co-contraction happening, quad/ham, whatever you want, say that. So if the part that's flexing is the flexor, that's concentric. The part that's slowing down the flexion, the quads are actually eccentric here because they allowed the knee to flex a little bit. So the quads right here are eccentric. This is not that big a deal to tease this detail out, but you need to understand that heel strike, you got that little bit of flexion in the knee. Okay? All right. So you kind of got both going on. Both are right, eccentric and concentric. The hams are concentric because they actually helped popliteus flex a little bit. The quads are eccentric because they allowed it to happen. Okay? All right, we'll just go with that. Let's jump to the ankle at heel strike because that's pretty important. Ankle. Where is this? What position is the ankle basically? Yeah, or you could say neutral, right? It's basically at its 90, isn't it? 0, 90, what do you want to call it? Whatever you want to call the ankle at heel strike, it's neutral, 0, 90. You can call it whatever you want of those. It's really 0. Okay, so if the ankle motion is this, where is the line in relation? The line is slightly posterior. Stephen, if the line is slightly posterior to the lateral malleolus, which is the axis, what moment is occurring at the ankle from the ground reaction? And if the line is hitting posterior, what would happen if muscles didn't act on it at that moment? Yep, plantar flexion. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so you need to know that at the heel strike, the moment is PF. Now, do you want at heel strike for the foot to hit the floor then? At heel strike, should the foot be going down? No. So you don't want PF. So what muscles have to act so PF doesn't happen? DF. Your dorsiflexors have to be on so the foot doesn't, what do we call this? Foot slap. So if you don't want foot slap, you need the dorsiflexors. So the muscle is DFers. The DFers, would it be eccentric or concentric? They're fighting PF. So it'd be eccentric, right? They're controlling eccentric. Because if we wanted more dorsiflexion, they would be concentric, but we just want it to hold or slow down. So it'd be isometric or eccentric. Okay? Does that make sense? You guys have a question? Okay. Okay.
They were getting kind of confused because in big red, actually at initial contact, it says that they're at full extension.
Does it?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
That's where we're getting some confusion going on back here. I mean, if you think about it, when you do hit, you do have slight flexion. Like I think you really do, because as soon as you get into foot flat, you actually have to be at 0. You have to be at full extension, right?
Not till mid stance.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Mid stance.
Yeah. So the answer key for this, and this was an old, oh gosh, what was this one? It wasn't Brunstrom, it was the old gate book. It says the 5 degrees. So,
yeah.
And hopefully this detail isn't going to be enough to throw off a question, but you do need to know that knee does soften right at heel strike. So
it needs for shock absorption.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it'll be curious to see. Yeah.
This book says that the knee's an extension while the hamstrings help stabilize the knee and prevent hyperextension.
I was going to say, because if you
Yeah.
were at full extension and you hit too hard, you would end up in hyperextension.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll have to go with that ambiguity, meaning there's a little gray area depending on how the question is asked. But we know that it's not rock hard full extension. It is a softened extension. Many authors will say there's a 5-degree flexion, but it's held there. That's why both muscles are contracting at the same time. It's when they really need to work together, co-contraction. Okay? Yeah.
Sorry, I realize that it's like a gray area. I just know that like the way that they would ask it, they might give you degrees of where your knee is at, and if we have like a specific degree in mind, let's just say 5 degrees, that could be an option, and that might be a question that you just threw because the book says 0.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to make sure, like, I know, because even though in real life nothing is black and white,
Mm-hmm.
it's all a gray area.
Mm-hmm.
When we go in to take our test, they
Mm-hmm.
come straight out of the book,
Yep.
and it is black and white.
Yep.
And that's why it's such a hard test, because
Yeah.
we worked in clinicals, and then we go in, and it's like, oh, this question reminds me of this patient that
Mm-hmm.
we had, and we want to make it a situational
Mm-hmm.
thing when really it's never like that.
Right. Right.
So my question was because they were asking me the same thing, is that if Big Red says one thing and Score Builder says the other thing, I always tell them to go with what Score Builders is telling them, because that's what you're supposed to be studying for the test, correct?
It's a good.
All on you.
Correct?
Mhm.
Am I correct in telling them that?
I don't want to say for sure. Yeah.
No.
So let's hope that this ambiguity would be clarified in a question so they're getting to what they need to ask.
Right.
And hopefully they're asking more about the ankle at heel strike and not the knee.
Yeah.
Because what's more important at the heel strike? Ankle. They're going to ask you about ankle. Okay? So let's just go with that. But we all know that the knee is fully extended, but it is actually softened to 5 degrees. And we'll just have to see how the question reads. Okay? And the quads and hams are definitely both firing. Otherwise, you'd have German shoulder. That's what you'd have. Okay? Okay.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
they're definitely going to ask you about knee extension at mid-stage.
Yeah, we're going to deal, yep.
Because that's the most
Yeah.
important thing at that point.
Yep.
You know, especially when you're looking at safety. So if you think about it as a safety question, what joint, when you're doing initial contact, is and then going through gait is going to be the biggest safety issue?
Right. So
The ankle.
for on the recording, for not hearing that, the talk about discrepancy in resources about at heel strike, what the knee is doing, whether it's at full extension, 0, or the 5 degree softened. And so knowing that at heel strike, we're going to focus on the ankle, we're going to just agree that we're going to be able to discern the question and see where they're getting, but we know that quads and hams both fire at that moment. But the focus will be on the ankle. You already identified that it's foot slap. So what muscle group opposes the foot slap from the plantar flexion moment? It's the dorsiflexors. And that's going to be isometric or eccentric, right? We're not asking it to dorsiflex more at that moment, but we are asking it to control and prevent plantar flexion, okay? So what type of dorsiflexion exercise would you do for someone who demonstrates foot slap at heel strike? I call them thumpers. You're going to do dorsiflexion. Open chain. Well, yeah, my foot's on the floor, but it's just concentric dorsiflexion. You can't really do eccentric unless you're a bat and you're hanging upside down from a pole or something and you're strapped on, and then you're going to do, like, there, yeah. Okay? Are we good for heel strike? All right, we're going to move to the next phase. Good conversation. Oops, let me get out of here. Okay, oops, I lied. All right, let's look at the next one. What is LR in Ranchos? Loading response. What is that in traditional? What did you see change? There's only really one thing that changed in this whole thing. The foot went down. What do you call that? Foot flat. So you got foot flat. Let's look at the hip. At the hip, really nothing changed. So for all intents and purposes, we're going to carry over the last one. We're going to say flexion, 25 degrees. Because if you watch me walk and I go from heel strike to foot flat, my hip hasn't moved. Okay, I'm just putting my foot down. And I'm softening my knee a little. So the hip is still here. And so where's the ground reaction force vector? It has moved because my body has moved. Where is the line in relation to the greater trochanter? It's still anterior. Very little, but it's still anterior. So what moment still is active at the hip if I collapse? Flexion. It's still a check mark. Do I want flexion here? No, I still want to hold. I'm still William Wallace, right? I'm still holding. So what muscle is still active? It's all lit up. The hip extensors. They're still firing. Now, since the hip didn't move, what kind of contraction is that? Isometric. Because we went from 25 degrees to 25 degrees. It didn't move, so I'm just holding. So let's just say the hip is still isometrically, the hip extensors are fighting a flexion moment isometrically. Can we all agree to that? All right, so again, if you see that sagittal plane lurch, work the butt. Okay, they probably had hip surgery and had that cut. All right, but what's going on at the knee? Where is the position of the knee? It is flexed a little bit. I don't know the angle. A check mark is enough there. You have to flex the knee to put the foot down, don't you? A little bit? So the knee is flexed. Where is the ground reaction force vector in relationship to the knee joint now? Uh-oh. So what happens when the line is behind the knee? What's the moment? Flexion. Check mark. Do we want flexion at that moment? We did, didn't we? We did, but did we want this? No. So what muscle group would control the rate of flexion when gravity is causing it, but I want it to happen, but I only want it to happen a little bit? The knee extensors would eccentrically allow that. So your quads would eccentrically be active here. Because what happens to a person who maybe is waiting for ACL surgery and their quads aren't firing well, and they step and it's like, whoop, oh, my knee gave out. Okay? Or you have some kind of meniscal problem and your knee gives out. You're going to notice it at that point in the gait because you have a flexion moment and you're like, whoops, my body went right into gravity. That makes sense? Mm-hmm. Because flexion is happening. It's going to happen whether we help it or not, but we don't want to fall. So our extensors eccentrically control the rate of flexion. Good. Okay? Are we ready for the ankle? Okay, and this is really what we're looking at this phase. So we have the foot has just flattened. What position is this foot in compared to the tibia? Where's the foot? Dorsiflexion or plantar flexion? It's plantar flexion, right? If the foot went from here and it landed, that's plantar flexion, right? Okay. Where is the gravity force vector compared to the ankle joint? Ever so slightly posterior. So what kind of moment would that have created? Plantar flexion, right? We already know what happens if people don't have anterior tib and they hit, it's going to go down. So we want that, but we don't want it fast. So what muscle, so the PF is the moment. What muscles are active to keep that from slapping? The DFers. So since they're controlling it, what kind of contraction is that? Eccentric. Falling gracefully. Okay? Good. All right, let's look at that mid stance. Now with the mid stance here, because it's a moment in time, you have the snapshot right before and right after. But we're actually going to talk about what happens at 12 o'clock, okay? So we have 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock. So let's look at it. We're going to kind of have an arrow here because now we are coming up. So mid stance in ranchos is mid stance, and in traditional it's mid stance. So we're good. So we're going from here to here. At the hip, where has the hip moved in? What position relative to the last position it was in? It's extending. It's unflexing, isn't it? It was flexed and now it's not. So it's extending. So the motion is extension or zero. So we're going to talk about the tallest point of mid stance. The hip is zero. Let's say it's 0. So where is the ground reaction force vector? Right before 0, it's anterior, and right after, it's posterior. So for that GRFB, you could put A arrow P, but for the most part, if it's going to be here, it's going to land posterior. Now, what do you know in normal plumb line gait or posture? Where does the plumb line hit in relation to the hip in quiet standing? Which would be equal to mid stance, right? It's ever so slightly posterior. What kind of moment does that create at the hip? Extension or flexion? Extension. Huh. What keeps you from hyperextending in quiet gait, in quiet stance? Try again. How about your Y ligament? No muscles help you stand at the hip. If you have full motion and you don't have a hip flexion contracture, and the line, the gravity line is ever so slightly behind the hip, gravity, nature has just given you a gift. You could stand there all day long like a horse can sleep. I think horses sleep standing up, right? They don't fall because they have all these passive moments, right? So in good standing posture, in normal mid stance, the plumb line, the gravity force is behind the hip joint, which creates a passive, peaceful extension moment, which you don't have to do anything for. It's a gift. So there is 0 muscle action. We're going to write 0 there for this conversation. It's quiet. Now, what do you know about most of your elderly patients and their hip extension range of motion? How much do they have? They don't have any, and they're stuck here, aren't they? If your patient, under your watch, develops a hip flexion contracture of any kind, you have just stolen from them the entire ability to get through mid-stance with a quiet hip and give their glutes a break. Okay? So if they are seated and they're supine a lot and they have hip tightness, we have got to get them into extension at least a few degrees so they can go through a normal mid-stance. If they're walking like this and they never get to enjoy this motion, what muscle is working overtime at the hip to keep them up? The butt. How strong is their butt? It's not. So they're leaning on a walker and they're exhausted. You try to walk like this all day, see how tired you are. They don't have low endurance. They're working 10 times harder than we are. Okay? So you never want to allow a hip flexion contracture. But in a normal individual, the hip is quiet right here. It just went from here, it was holding, and now it's like, I get a break, let my lower leg do the rest of the work. So right here it's quiet, unless there's a problem. All right, so let's move on to the knee. The knee, as we've mentioned, goes from this slightly relaxed flex position, and at mid-stance, what position is the knee in? Clearly, extension. 0 degrees, extension, line. Where is the ground reaction force vector once we get up there? It moves from posterior to anterior. And when it's anterior, the moment in the knee is what? Flexion or extension? If the line is anterior, if science and research is telling us that's where the line is, what would we have to say? Extension. What do we know about quiet standing and the plumb line? Where does the plumb line fall? Where is it supposed to fall? So do you need muscle activity there? No. So again, if you have full extension and they're going through this, they went from flexion to extension, but they had to get there. So there is muscle activity at this one. What muscle will extend the knee when you want extension? The extender, right? So it's the quads that has to get you there. So is it doing its job or is it slowing something else down? Is it concentric or eccentric? It's concentric. So the quads are concentric to get you into mid-stance, right? So if someone has weak quads, what will you notice about their gait and their mid-stance? They don't really get there, do they? Okay? And they're not going to walk like this, so they're going to bend both knees. Okay, good. Let's look at the ankle. It's an extension moment if you have full range. If you don't have full range, what's happening? If you don't have full range at the knee yet, gait is always behind you. And now what will they do? They might go on their toes to kind of get it going, okay? All right, at the ankle, you just went from this plantar flexion to what? Relatively speaking, what did the tibia do over the foot? It dorsiflexed, right? So that position is what? DF. The motion is DF. In mid-stance, you're 0, DF, whatever you want to call it. Where is that line now in relation to the ankle joint? Anterior. So what kind of moment? Let's have somebody who hasn't answered a moment question yet. By that, do you mean plantar flexion or dorsiflexion? There's a dorsiflexion moment? Yes. Does everybody see that? There's a dorsiflexion moment. Do we want dorsiflexion at mid-stance? Do we want to come out of plantar flexion and go into dorsiflexion? Yes. Do we want our tibia to collapse over our foot? No, we don't want it that fast. So what muscle group would control the rate of dorsiflexion since it's happening by gravity's momentum? What muscle group would slow down DF? The PFers, right? The PFers would slow down the DFers. Does that, everybody got that? So what kind of contraction would that be? Eccentric. And you can see that these gastrocs are all lit up for you here. So the control of the tibia over the foot is a gastroc function, okay? What if somebody had a heel cord rupture? What would you see happen right there? Doink! They would be completely over, okay? So what kind of contraction are the plantar flexors exerting over the ankle to slow down the rate of dorsiflexion? We want dorsiflexion, but we don't want it too fast. Eccentric. Good? So the quads and the gastrocs are pretty important during this early stance phase. All right, let's jump up to the hip at TST. What is TST? Terminal stance, and what is traditional for that? Heel off, right? Okay, so we got heel off at the hip. What has happened? We went from 0, and now we are like kind of like that. What is that? Hip flexion or extension happened? Hip extension now. So now we're coming through, okay? Kind of getting back into our A-frame, double stance. The hip extension happened. At what moment? Where is the line in relationship to the hip there? It is slightly posterior. So there is an extension moment, right? It was kind of hanging up there, but we needed to kind of go further. Now, if we were really splitting hairs, the propulsion of the lower leg is putting it there. But if there was a muscle active and we had electrodes, probably the glutes would be firing a bit too. And if you're walking fast or running, the glutes are going to fire. But in just quiet walking, the glutes don't have to act a lot, but let's just say they are. We'll just say the extensors are concentrically extending because we want extension. We're going to go with the flow of gravity and the ground reaction force. But let's just give the glutes a little credit for pushing us forward, okay? But that's not really what we're worried about right here. If we're going to collapse on the glutes, it's going to be at heel strike. What's going on at the knee between full, tall extension and mid stance and lifting the heel off the floor? What happened? What did the knee do? What position is it in? It's flexed. Where is that line in relationship to that? It started out from the last one anterior, but now where is it? It's hard to see on this picture, but it's slightly posterior. So let's just call it posterior. So what moment is happening? When I pick my heel up, it kind of thrusts my knee. Let's just call it let's call it a flexion moment. But this is the funnest, trickiest part of the gait cycle here. Because there's not a whole lot of moment on the knee. There's kind of a negligible impact of the ground reaction force vector. What's really happening at the knee is coming from the ankle. It's really coming from the ankle. So here's your bonus question. Don't answer right away. What muscle just flexed the knee here? What muscle flexed the knee? What do you think? Gastroc. Michael Jackson. The only time that it does both. So a muscle does what? All or nothing. It flexes or it contracts or it doesn't contract. It's connected as a plantar flexor and as a knee flexor. And it is doing the job it was called to do all its life. Propel me off of my foot, get my heel off the ground and push me forward. My knee has to come along because it's connected. And the moments are all right too, okay? So unlike when I'm straight here and I'm trying to plantar flex but leave the knee straight, at this point I need the knee to flex, and the perfect thing is the gastroc's going to do it. So the muscle at the knee that just flexed the knee is the gastroc. Hamstring didn't do this, okay? Hamstring wouldn't want to know what to do in a closed chain position unless you're wheeling on a stool. But in a closed chain position, knee flexion happens from the gastroc. So it's the gastroc. Is it doing its thing? Yes. So it's concentric. Against the weight of the body, it's really working. Someone who doesn't have gastroc firing, they don't have this motion. They do this. They don't have propulsion and active knee flexion. They might do this. Okay? All right. So that's concentric. Let's look at the ankle. What's happening at the ankle at toe off? What position did it move into? From here to here. What position is that? Definitely plantar flexion. And where's the line? Anterior. So what's the moment? What? Dorsiflexion. Do we want dorsiflexion? No. Heck no. We want plantar flexion. We want it to lift the body. So what kind of contraction are the PFers doing to fight the dorsiflexion moment? Concentric with all they got. Giving it all she's got, Scotty. Right? So it's doing its thing. It's like, I was made for this. Okay. Good. What's the last phase? Pre-swing, and what do you call it in traditional? Toe off. Now this picture doesn't quite have the toe off, but we're just going to go in that split second. Okay. At the hip, there's actually no line up here anymore because at the moment that the toes come off, there actually is no more ground reaction force. It's just swinging. So at the hip, what position has the hip moved into compared to last position? It's flexing, isn't it? And the moment was extension. What muscle is going to actually bring the hip into flexion here? Quads or knee extender. Yes, they're attached to the hip, but they only flex the hip on Saturday night when the quads are off or when the hip flexors are off. Like they're a knee extender, the quads. They're hooked here for control, but don't jump to them as hip extensors or flexors. It's your hip flexors, which are what? Iliopsoas. So for the first time, your hip flexors actually got to do something. You can even see them here. So the hip flexors are going to flex. So what kind of contraction would that be? Concentric. They're saying their name. Flex. So the hip flexors are flexing to bring the leg through. What's happening at the knee? What position did it move from? The knee is doing this. It's getting ready to swing. What did it just move into? Flexion. Where's the line in relation to the knee right before the foot comes off? Posterior. So what kind of moment is that? It's a flexion moment, but the minute the foot comes off the floor, there is no line, okay? So we're still talking about the momentum of the last motion. So there's not a whole lot of moment there. There was a flexion moment, and we're going to stick with the same answer to the last one. What muscle flexed the knee here? Gastroc. And it did it in concentric, right? So let's say you have a person who has recovering gastroc, and you notice they don't have propulsion. They don't have this nice push-off. What kind of exercise would you do for that person? Open or closed chain gastroc? Closed chain, because it's stance phase, right? You could do toe raises. So if you're in the lower phase, you could do that total gym with less gravity on them, 2 feet, and then 1 foot, and then raise it up until you can go up, standing up like a big person, and then you do 2 feet, 1 foot. Then you could go on the step and go lowering and raising, because isn't the gastroc controlling the tibia down along with the quad, right? Okay. All right. Let's look at the ankle. What is the ankle doing right here? It's finishing off the plantar flexion, isn't it? Okay, it's like, okay. What kind of moment is there? Where's the line? Anterior. What did we say that moment is, Raul? If the line's in front of the ankle, what kind of moment is that? If everything fell apart right then, what would the ankle do based on the line in front of it? It would. And we don't want dorsiflexion there. So which muscle's active? The PFers. And since they need to do PF, it's going to be concentric. They're going to stick the landing here, aren't they? They're going to finish it off. Okay, what questions about stance phase do you have? Does that make sense? Do you understand moments? So when you get a question, and we're going to do the swing phase in about 2 minutes. When you get a question on the test and it's asking you about a joint and a motion and a muscle, I want you to go elementary on it. I want you to go, what plane are we talking about? And then what joint did they ask me? And where's the effect of gravity on this joint in this position? And then you say, what's the question? What's controlling it? What's moving it? So if gravity's moving it, then it's the eccentric control to control it. If you're moving it against gravity, it's concentric of the muscle that does that action. You'll save yourself. So if they ask you a hip question, don't answer about the back. They ask you a knee, don't answer about the hip. Okay? Even though that's also happening and you can see it, you're too far steps forward, okay? All right, flip your paper over real quick. We're going to do this in about 30 seconds. Now we're on swing phase. Okay? Then we get to eat lunch. Okay, swing phase. So now we don't have, look what happened. The line disappeared. There is no line. There's no ground reaction force because there's no ground reaction. So now we're talking about the swing leg. What's ISW? Initial swing. What is that in traditional? Acceleration. Make sure you know those. So now we're here. Where's the hip? You notice we're missing a few extra pieces here. It's just, what's the motion? Flexion, right? And we want flexion. So what muscle group is working? The flexors. What kind of contraction? Concentric. You're going to see a pattern. If a person has weak flexors, what will the gait look like? They might turn their adductors on and by rotating and pulling it through that way, or they could swing it around with circumduction. So what would you exercise to repair that lacking hip flexion? Hip flexors, open chain or closed chain? Open, because it's open. And again, unless you're a bat hanging upside down, you're not really, or you're doing sit-ups with your feet anchored, okay? All right. At the knee, what's happening at the knee at initial swing? Flexion. Do we want flexion? Yes. What muscle group is actually flexing here? Finally, the hamstrings. Now, some of this is happening from the gastroc a second ago, but to carry it through, the hamstrings are probably going to get a little bit of credit. Okay, and what else? At the ankle, yeah, but we're at the knee. Yeah, you're good. And of course, we also have like sartorius and adductors, but we're only dealing with the straight. So yes, those come in. Pull a groin muscle, you'll go, oh yeah, I know exactly where they come in, okay? All right. So the flexors are flexing. So what kind of contraction is that? Concentric. Okay. So the knee's lifting. What's happening at the ankle here? We just went from the most aggressive plantar flexion we've got, and now what? Dorsey, dorsey, dorsey. So we have a dorsiflexion position. The dorsiflexors have to do it, so it has to be concentric. And we're coming through. We're at mid-swing, which is mid-swing, right, in traditional. What's happening at the hip? More flexion. What muscles are helping? The flexors. What kind of contraction? Concentric. Now we're at the knee. This is right after mid-swing, so yeah, we're still in flexion. Don't let the picture fool you. I'm sorry, I lied. From here, it depends on if you're ranchos or traditional, whether it's when the femur is perpendicular to the floor or the tibia. I don't know who cares? But what's happening at the knee is it's extending. I misspoke. As you come through, the knee has to start to extend.
Oh.
Let's call this extension, okay? So what muscle would be doing that here? The quads, the extensors, okay? Because they're actually, because gravity itself would just drop my leg, wouldn't it? So I have to actually oppose gravity. Okay, so my extensors are going to extend, and so that's what kind of contraction? Okay. Now, once we get to the end of swing, at the hip you're finishing at flexion, nothing's changed. You want flexion, you need your flexors to do it, they're still concentrically. Hip flexors the whole time, right? You get to the very end, what's happening to the hip flexors? You're going to start switching back to eccentric and stop the whole thing.
Going back to mid-swing, everything's the same with the ankle, right?
Oh, I didn't give you the ankle. Yes, it's dorsiflexed. It really needs to dorsiflex, and you're going to do it concentrically. Okay, thanks. Okay, so at the last one, depends on how you want to view this. Yes, it's still hip flexors, but at the very end, we know we're preparing to stop and decelerate. So the deceleration part would be glute max or the extensors, eccentric. Otherwise, you have like NFL kicker where they let it go the whole way. You don't want it to go the whole way. You need it to stop. So your flexors are going to give way to your extensors, eccentrically decelerating hip flexion. Okay. It's not aggressive. They don't even light up the muscles here. It's not a big deal. But just in your head, you should know that the glutes would decelerate. At the knee, what's happening? You went from this extension, and then we know at the end it's going to flex a little, but extension, quads still, concentric, until the very last second when we need the hamstrings to come in and control that and decelerate it. So in the purest sense, at the end of terminal swing, you do have hamstrings kicking in to help decelerate. So it's quads and then quads and hams. Okay? There's quite a bit of muscle activity shown in research, like electrode studies, myelogram studies of the hamstrings. They fire quite a bit here. Okay? And then at the end, we have the ankle doing what? Holding its position. We need dorsiflexion. You could say isometric if you want, because it's just kind of holding at this point. Concentric isn't wrong. You know, we're not. Okay, so if you have weak dorsiflexors during swing, what do you call that? It's different than stance. Foot drop? That's a little different than foot slap. So what kind of contraction are you missing on dorsiflexors here? Concentric, not eccentric. So what would you do to exercise? You would do concentric exercises, right? And you would name it differently. What would be the compensation? So a question might not ask you, what is it called when the foot drags the floor? They might say, you notice the patient is stepping high like this, and that they don't appear to have dorsiflexion when they walk. What's the exercise? So you already have to know, oh, that's foot drop, and this is the compensation, and the exercise would be concentric dorsiflexion strengthening. Okay? Make sense? Okay, does that help? I hope it doesn't leave you more confused. All right, let's take a much needed lunch break and enjoy whatever you guys brought.